Good evening, everyone. I hope all is well with everyone. Thank you all for being present for our presentation. So I'm going to start off by introducing myself, and we'll be introducing ourselves and then we'll jump right in. My name is Mallory Branch. I prefer she, her, and hers pronouns.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Celia Tavares, and I also prefer she, her, hers pronouns.
Hello, my name is Adiana Kaplan. I also prefer she, her pronouns.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Becky Duarte, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Hi, everyone. My name is Taylor Zavala, and my pronouns are they, them, and theirs.
Thank you so much, you all. Thank you, Taylor. And we'll jump right in. So restorative justice is respect. Respect for all. Even those who are different from us, even though we seem to be our enemies, even those who seem to be our enemies. Respect remind us of our interconnectedness, but also of our differences. Respect insists we balance our concerns for all parties. If we pursue justice as respect, we will do justice restoratively. That's how it sounds. Next slide, please. So this is our agenda. So these are some of the things that you can expect for us to touch on tonight. Introduction, policy and data, practical applications and resources, historical background, evidence-based practice. Next slide, please. Introduction. So we've introduced ourselves, so here we are. Next slide, please. So at this time, I would like you to take a moment and look at the person next to you, find your elbow partner, and reflect on a time that you've harmed someone and it was left unresolved. Or better yet, think about a time where you were harmed by someone and it was unresolved. How could restorative justice have helped you in either of those situations? Take a moment to think about that and talk about it with your person next to you. Okay, next slide, please.
So, restorative justice. What is restorative justice? The definition of restorative justice has changed over the years, but the definition that we'll be going on today is restorative justice is a philosophy, a set of practices rooted in indigenous teachings that emphasizes human interconnections by repairing relationships when harm occurs while proactively building and maintaining relationships to prevent future harm. And that is by David Ryan Barksdale Castro Harris, recently in 2020. And he states that he uses all his names to acknowledge all of his ancestors. And with that said, I also want to just give you a couple of pointers. So back in the 1970s, there was a man by the name of Mark Yancey, a probation officer who arranged for two teenagers to meet directly with the victims following some vandalism sprees that occurred. And they agreed to a resolution. So I think this really kind of started things back in the 1970s. I think it was 1974. And this is how some of the things got started between him as a probation officer. He also went on to open a nonprofit organization to kind of get the ball rolling in restorative justice and to show restorative practices within the community. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Celia for the next section. Thank you.
Thank you, Mallory. So just talking a little bit about the historical context of restorative justice. Mallory kind of highlighted just like the very beginning as far as the I believe she said probation officer in conducting that meeting. But restorative justice also comes based off on just certain issues that needed to be addressed, right? So one of those issues is disproportionality of discipline. Disproportionality of discipline results due to policies that appear racially neutral on their face. And that usually causes an overrepresentation of students of color and suspensions, expulsions, and referrals for infractions such as defiance or what is considered defiance. And then here we have Secretary of Education Arne Duncan in 2010 actually delivered a speech that highlighted racial disparities in school suspension and expulsion, which called for more rigorous civil rights enforcement and education. He talked about specifically students with disabilities, Black students, and male students. He pretty much stated that students with disabilities and Black students, especially males, were suspended far more than their white counterparts. And he also noted that they were also punished more severely for similar behavior. Next slide, please. Another issue, just in regards to discipline, or not really an issue, but it's more like a little bit of history of what has transpired throughout the years. So some interventions that they've created throughout the years to address some of the issues are response to interventions, which started around the 70s and went through the early 2000s. Then there's positive behavior interventions and supports, which started around the 90s, and then IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And then zero tolerance policy. And that's the response to drugs, weapons, and gangs equity through color blindness, control, and compliance. And again, it started around the 90s. These approaches have frequently been critiqued for not specifically addressing just racial dynamics, economic obstacles, and just other racial gaps that we encounter. Next slide, please. And then there is school to prison pipeline, which resulted as a result of the zero tolerance policies for school violations. And it resulted in the doubling of number of students suspended annually from schools. There was an increase in the presence of police in schools and the enactment of laws mandating referral of children to law enforcement authorities. Since 1992, 45 states have passed laws making it easier to try juveniles as adults, and 31 have stiffened sanctions against youth for a variety of offenses. And oftentimes these youths are taught by unqualified teachers, tested on material that they never reviewed. They're held back in their grades, placed in restrictive programs, repeatedly suspended, you know, pretty much just faced with adversity. And the likelihood that the same youth that face those issues will end up arrested and incarcerated is high. Next slide, please. So as a way to kind of combat those issues, restorative justice has been created, implemented, talked about, and just, you know, kind of pushed out there to use as a way to address this proportionality. And it's something that continues to be developed, to grow. In order for it to grow, there's two things, right, that kind of we need to keep in mind. And it's just to continue to implement practices in the schools, and then just address some of the issues that have been impacting the students in that sense. So that's a little bit of the history. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Taylor for policy.
Go to the next slide. Awesome. So I'm going to talk about policy and data today. So we'll see what's new in legislation, as well as what the data has shown. Next slide, please. So existing law requires students to receive other means of correction, such as participation in a restorative justice program prior to receiving a suspension. So this new bill, AB 2598, requires that the State Department of Education develops evidence-based practices for restorative justice practice implementation on school campuses, as well as make the best practices available on the department's internet website on or before June 1st of 2024, and requires that the department take specific actions in developing best practices. And when they are developing these best practices, the department shall consult with all of the following parties to identify the best practices for an effective evidence-based restorative justice practice within both elementary and secondary schools. So the first would be school-based restorative justice practitioners, who are kind of like our those who have like the most knowledge about it, as well as educators from public schools serving grades kindergarten, 1st through 12, all inclusive. Pupils from public schools serving kindergarten and grades 1 through 12 inclusive, community stakeholders, nonprofit and public entities, and for the purposes of the section, local educational agency means a school district, county office of education, or charter school. Next slide, please. All right, so for the data, from the data that we found, it showed that suspension rates for students of color are actually higher than for white students, even in schools that utilize alternatives to suspension like restorative justice practices. One study in 2016 found that restorative practices were used more often on Black and Latinx students than white students within the same school. And another study from 2013 found that restorative practices were actually less likely to be systematically implemented at schools that serve predominantly Black and Latinx students. So that means they're receiving more punitive practices that are being upheld within those districts and those schools. Another article from 2011 examined 3 years worth of disciplinary data from 72 elementary schools across 7 different states that were using school-wide positive behavioral supports, a method of non-punitive discipline similar to the restorative justice practices. And although narrower than the national average, this so-called discipline gap persisted in the data, specifically among African American students who were overrepresented among the students who were receiving disciplinary referrals. There is also another article in 2012. The study showed that disaggregated disciplinary data from 155 elementary schools and 46 middle schools across 4 different states found that African Americans were consistently overrepresented in the students receiving secondary support, which is extremely problematic because they're not gaining the same support as everybody else, further widening that gap. And then there was another study in 2011 that found that although the precedence of school-wide positive behavioral supports was associated with decreased exclusions in both elementary and secondary schools, white students benefited most from the decrease, whereas Black students remained overrepresented. Go ahead to the next slide. So according to the data that was found, some ways to make restorative justice effective are that it was shown that schools will only be able to successfully implement these practices if they fully change their view of discipline. So seeing it as an opportunity to build students' capacity to consider how their behavior is impacting the greater school community, rather than a punitive reaction to the students' inability to follow a specific set of rules. And many schools used safety as an excuse to continue harmful disciplinary practices. Another point was that schools and districts should recognize that restorative justice is not simply a set of behavior modification techniques or a way to reduce conflict, but rather a whole philosophy that would need to be adopted not just in schools, but at all levels of the educational system, including in administration and district level. 2 conditions for bringing about hegemonic shift, which is the widespread groundswell change and common sense beliefs that would cause sustainable social change, is first, the first condition is that proliferation of what has been called organic intellectuals, or members of the oppressed class who understand the plight of their peers firsthand, need to decide to take action against the reality in which they find themselves. And the second, more crucial corresponding requirement is that the traditional intellectuals, or those who are perpetuating the existing structures of domination, need to either convert die off, or become too irrelevant to prevent the new hegemony from taking hold. So that was another standpoint. And if restorative justice practices are to create a hegemonic shift, they need to do more than change the mindsets of the oppressed. They need to be sites for teachers, administrators, and staff to surface and confront their biases. They also need to be a space for families and students to organically build relationships with their school's personnel that resist the traditionally oppressive forces in which schools and institutions have cast them. And such should not be the unlabeled labor of the Black or Latinx middle manager. A lot of these schools were hiring Black and Latinx folks who were working with the student populations to provide these restorative justice practices, while there were still a lot of white folks who were in places of power within the school, whether it was administration as the teachers or within the district. So there was no actual like systemic like shifts that were actually happening or long-term shifts. It should be the labor of the school leaders. Data found that so yeah, it should actually be a labor of the school leaders. The field needs a model of culturally responsive restorative practices that allows for adult staff transformation as well as the healing of interpersonal harms. Justice cannot be restored if it does not exist in the first place. And with that, I will let Becky take over for the next portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Taylor. If you can go to the next slide, yes. So how does this evidence-based practice look like for staff, teachers in the classroom? If you can go to the next slide, Ariana. So restorative justice in school is an evidence-based practice that can be used with a multi-tier systems of support. It should be the practice, restorative justice or restorative practices, which is interchangeably used in schools. When we're talking about this practice, should be used 80% as a preventative approach and 20% it should be for repairing harm. Restorative practices occur on a continuum from informal to formal approaches, and both should be used proactively to build healthy relationships and community, and or responsively to respond to conflict and wrongdoing in schools. Although restorative justice can be used as a behavioral management tool, advocates who have studied the implementation of restorative justice or restorative practices in schools point out that if it is only used as a behavioral management tool, restorative justice only runs the risk of being identified as another form of punishment, but it also removes it from having its greater impact and the implications being ignored. Next slide, please. Okay. So in the classroom, in schools and classrooms, restorative practices can be implemented in various ways, from the use of daily communication approaches to resolving conflicts in and out of classrooms. So for example, effective statements, which are used to build and maintain relationships day to day. These are crucial for creating a positive environment. These statements usually start with I statements. There's also community building circles. So proactively building relationships and community among classrooms. Circles can be used daily as check-ins, check-outs, to classroom norms and agreements. Also maybe when there's any type of social or emotional skills to be learned, providing feedback, or also to discuss any issues or topics that are going on. Setting classroom agreements and norms, so creating procedures and routines with the class to adopt trauma-informed safe environments, and small impromptu conferences, which usually are used, when there's something that needs to be discussed among the classroom. Restorative justice or practices in classrooms can also support and be integrated with other evidence-based practices, such as social emotional learning and positive behavior interventions and support, also known as PBIS. So restorative justice and SEL, they both are positive approaches to student behavior. They promote positive environments and give students direct opportunities to develop and use positive skills. So for example, in using circles, right? Being able to adapt those as daily check-ins along with the SCLs when students are taught skills about active listening, showing empathy, they're able to apply these skills in their restorative practice circles. And they're able to kind of show empathy when participating in a circle of understanding, and they're more equipped to solve a dilemma in a conflict of circle. Then there's restorative justice and PBIS. Both PBIS and restorative justice seek to improve school classroom climate, increase student achievement, build social emotional capacity, improve emotional regulation, keep kids in the classroom increase during instruction time, and improve teacher classroom management. So with using those, for example, you can be using them to meet goals, right? So when trying to provide clear, consistent routines and expectations, such as creating classroom norms or agreements, being able to use that in a positive manner to improve your classroom, that leads to a better functioning classroom and school communities. And with that said, I will pass it over to Ariana.
Thanks so much, Becky. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the practical applications and some resources. I wanted to dig in a little bit more. Becky sort of referenced this before, and I believe Celia did also in her section of the presentation, the sort of RTI, or response to intervention model. So when we think about like, how do we apply restorative justice or restorative practices at a whole school level, we're really thinking about, as much as possible, sort of within the context of this 3-tier model. So everyone at the school is in a restorative practices school, practicing community building, right? Whether that's in the classroom, whether it's in the hallways, et cetera. We didn't talk about this before, but we sort of talk about like a warm demander stance. So the idea that we are both supportive, loving, and firm at the same time, right? Students need to have sort of a container within the school system to be able to respond to create safety and to create a sense of like they know what the expectations are. And so having clear and consistent expectations and consequences is really important. And then also to have students really feel engaged in what they're learning in the classroom, right? So all of this sort of at a whole school level, we want to be focused on like relationships, community, strong communication, et cetera. And even if we do all of that really, really well, we know that sometimes harm still is going to occur because we're human beings, and that's the thing that happens. And so then we sort of move into this tier 2 response section, right? And this is really where we're sort of managing difficulties, disruptions, and responding to conflict. This might look like having a restorative conversation with the student. It might look like having a harm circle in your classroom. It might look like doing some kind of peer conferencing. But the idea is that human beings create harm, right? It's part of who we are. And that conflict can really be a growth opportunity and an opportunity to sort of heal and restore. And so in that tier 2, we're really looking at that. And then tier 3 is really, even when both of those prior sections are going really well, we recognize that there will still be some individual students that struggle for a variety of reasons. And so then we're really looking at how do we get students connected to individualized supports. This might be like a family conference. It might also be reentry, right? Students who are transitioning back to school from juvenile justice or from a suspension or expulsion. We want to be able to welcome students back into our community with an opportunity to repair the harm that had been created and to also get support. And finally, here's some really wonderful resources. Our presentation was short and obviously did not cover everything you need to know about restorative justice. So here's some great practical tools that you can use to support in growing your practices of restorative justice. They're linked into the slides, which we can share with you. So there's the Little Book of Restorative Justice in Education. The Little Book series in general is really great. They have a ton of great information. Circle Forward has a bunch of like agendas for circles and that address different sorts of topics. So that's really helpful. And it also does a good job of sort of explaining in more depth some of the philosophies behind restorative justice. And then the OUSD RJ implementation guide actually does a really good job of sort of how you can think about if your school's in the beginning stages of implementing restorative justice, how do you go from the very start of introducing it to staff, to admin, et cetera, and the steps that may be needed in order to fully implement restorative justice at your school. And we also have a list of references here. These are different articles that were drawn from to develop this presentation. There's a ton of resources and references out there about restorative justice that we encourage you to continue to look into and grow your understanding of restorative justice. We want to say thank you so much for taking the time to hear us out on restorative justice. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to us. This is our contact information.